All right, so we're back, and this time we're looking at 2019.8 and 2019.9 and covering the various features that have come out in those releases. We're on a bit of a binge at the moment. These last couple of releases, there's been a lot of changes to bring some new features to some effects, etc., or some new settings, or just slight alterations to some existing settings to try and make them a little better. So let's go through some of those. So let's go to our sequencer. The first thing I should mention is you'll notice that when I select an effect now, it actually shows where in the timeline that particular effect is. In this case, I'm doing an animation. It's actually not that useful. But when you have an audio track up here, having this in place inside the WAV file can actually be kind of nice, particularly when you're moving things, to see exactly where it lines up to with the waveform. So that's kind of cool. Let's talk about some other things. So let's start with ripple. These are alphabetical. I don't know if anyone ever realized that, but there's ripple there. So let's bring ripple in. So Scott's made a minor change here. He's introduced the rotation, but he's added a value curve. Sorry, a value curve on the rotation setting. Although, oh, maybe it's nice. I'm not sure what he's done as to why rotation or... Oh, there we are. Oh, okay. Oh, I see what he's done. All right. So what he's done is he's only made the value curve available for certain circumstances. So here I can rotate the star around, and I can also add the value curve to change the amount of rotation of the star over time. In this case, it's slowing down because of how I set the value curve. Okay, so he's tried, so he's put a bunch of validation in here so that things are only available when he's obviously done the work in the background to implement the algorithm to rotate. So I think he did the star. Not sure he did much else. So he did the star and the triangle. No, the triangle's not there. Polygon, yeah, polygon's there. And you can set that square and all sorts of things. And yeah, I think that's, oh no, it's available there on the snowflake as well. Not that's a very good snowflake, but there are a bunch here that it's not available as well. So yeah, a few rotation settings. He's done the same thing with shape. A cover shape, but there's a whole bunch of changes in shape. So Scott's made some changes to shape in that he's added rotation. So if I set it to squares, he's added a rotation here, so I can make these diamonds instead just by rotating them, and it's just rotating the shapes, and it has a value curve as well. But there's a whole bunch of other things that have been added to this particular panel. I've added velocity, so if you set it to non-zero, over their life they now move, and you get to choose in which direction they move. You can also set a random movement where they now all move in different random directions up to a random speed as well. So it's both a random movement and a random speed, if you like. And if you also take away the random location, they now all look like they're coming out of a single point but going off in different directions. If you get rid of the random movement, they'll all go in the same direction. And you might just want to increase the velocity a bit so they move further away and maybe move the direction somewhat. So yeah, there's a few new settings in the shape effect there, so you can do a couple of different things with the shape. if you are generating them in random locations, you can get rid of the random movement. You can have them all go off in the same direction as well. So that's the shape effect and the changes to that. There were some changes from Dan in the way in which solids were drawn along with the meshes and the lights, and I believe he did this primarily, and I don't know if this is going to be the best way to show it. If I make this a floodlight, come on. There we go. Yeah. Bring it around. Oops. Actually hitting the up down rather than. So you can see he's fixed apparently. Well, I understand. I hadn't seen it personally, but I believe there were some render issues previously with it where it wouldn't draw properly. I think it's probably debatable whether there's still some render issues, but I believe it's a bit better in terms of how things like that render now. We talked about the option to move the 00 location. That was actually in 2019.8. We talked about showing the selected effect in the waveform, channel remapping of the DMX effect. So this is kind of useful when you're importing a sequence. Let's say you've bought a sequence from someone and it happens to have a bunch of DMX settings in it. Maybe some static ones, maybe some curves, etc., etc. And that's all well and good, but you bring them onto your prop and it turns out that all your props, the channels, are in different orders. So his pan channel is channel 1, but your pan channel is channel 8 or something. So now there's this remap channels here. And so what you can say is all the data that's currently on channel 1, I actually want that to go to channel 8. And the data on channel 2, I want that to go onto, let's go to channel 7 and click OK. And you can see what it's done is it's copied the data from channel 1 and 2 onto 7 and 8. Now, if you'd copied other data onto channels 1 and 2, it would have handled that and just swapped all the data around, etc. But you can use it to copy data between channels, but you can also use it to shuffle channels around into a different order. So if you're importing someone's sequence which has a moving head and all of their channels are slightly different, you can fix them up without having to go back and redo it all from scratch. So hopefully I'll save you some time. All right, add to check sequence. Okay, the faces and states. One of the interesting. Well, I'm going to show why I put it in here first, but it works with a few different things. So in here you can go and save a viewpoint, and I can call it a name, right? And then I can call it back. I load viewpoint Fred, and it'll jump back to that viewpoint. And then obviously when I'm sequencing. I can come in here and I can sequence my cube and I can come up to here and I can say per preview and I can choose that camera angle and it now is actually using that camera angle to sequence that particular element. And that's kind of cool, but you run into a problem when you share this sequence because someone else might then import my cube effects onto their sequence. But if they don't have a camera called Fred, then it's not going to come in properly. And so what we've done in check sequence is, which you can run once you've loaded up someone's sequence that you're about to import, you can go and grab check sequence, open it up, and right at the bottom of check sequence, there will be these sections down here, which says, you know, if you're planning on importing this sequence, be aware the sequence relies on the following items that will not be imported. So if there are any model faces that are being used within the sequence, they will be listed here along with the model that they're currently present on. If there's any states, and very few people use states, but for those that do, they'll be listed there as well. And then any viewpoints, in this case here, the Fred viewpoint is shown here. And so I'll know that when I import this sequence, it's going to be dependent upon this viewpoint called Fred, and maybe I want to go and create a viewpoint called Fred in my sequence. I might have a look at the other person's sequence, see where that viewpoint is, and create one in mine before I import their sequence, and I'll have a lot fewer issues. All right, let's move on. Let's talk render cache. Render cache at the moment doesn't happen all the time. It's a very powerful feature. It's particularly useful if you're using things like video and the like. It can dramatically speed up your render times. I've seen people with many minutes of render times being reduced to a few seconds of render times just by turning on render caching. And as long as they don't change the effects that have been cached, it just reads all of the render data out of a file on the disk and puts it straight onto the model, and it saves a huge amount of time. But it only does it for a handful of effects, and the reason it does that is because most effects don't actually take that long to render, and it seemed like a waste of time to consume a whole bunch of memory with all of this render caching, when at the end of the day I could just produce it just as quickly and not put as much strain on the memory of the machine. But there are a couple of settings that you can put onto certain effects that will actually slow things down. One is blur. Anything above a blur of 1 or 2 can get quite slow to process because of the amount of math that has to happen. And so now whenever the blur is set to anything other than 1, it will start to render cache even some of the more trivial effects. And the other one is the rotations here. Anytime that you've done any rotations in RotoZoom, those things can also take a while to render. And so now they're going to be render cached as well automatically if you turn on any of the rotations. So yeah. Hopefully that'll speed up some people's rendering. So the next one has been added in a couple of places, but we're going to have to go and create a different sequence. So let's discard that one. We're going to create a musical sequence. We're not going to play anything. Let's just make sure it's very quiet just in case we accidentally do. So we've had a VU meter up here for quite some time. Everyone loves VU meter. It's a great way to auto sequence. But there's now a new option, and that's this gain setting here. And what it does is it will take, it doesn't work on every single setting here. It'll be disabled when it's not available. But what it basically acts like is a preamplifier for the signal before it's displayed. So if I push the gain up, you can see that the waveform becomes a lot bigger and it maxes out a lot more. If I move it into the negative territory, you can see it becomes quite small. That becomes really cool with things like not level bar, but you know, something like an intensity wave. If I want it to be more red all the time, I'll just pump it up, and it'll be more often at the high end because I've pumped up the signal. Whereas if I bring it down here, it's going to be at the other end because it's almost never going to get anywhere. So here it's more white because that's the higher end, and here it's more red because that's the lower end. So it acts as this sort of preamplifier, which can help you fine tune a number of these things. So if you're doing, I don't know, level shape, well, the gain allows you to bring down the size of the particular element. Much like sensitivity, because you're just changing the strength of the signal before it gets applied. Well, like I said, it works on a whole bunch of them. Volume bars is a great place for it. So if you just want things to jump up and down, if you set this to 1, you can see how it jumps up and down. But if you want it to be more emphasized, you can just pump it all up and you get that extra gain, and it's going to jump up and down a lot more often. So that's gain. Now, the other place that I've put gain is actually in the value curve. Another great place to show that is on the fill effect. So it has this position parameter, which is how far it's full. Well, a while ago, we added the music value curve, and the music value curve basically takes the shape of the waveform and turns that into the value curve. But now with the music, I've added a gain as well. So again, you can choose to lower the gain, which will reduce the amount of amplitude you get out of that. So another way to fine tune, get more options. The other thing I did in this one is I added an inverted a value curve as well for the music. And what this does is, if I come in here, so basically if the waveform is high, the inverted music will make it low. And so it's kind of the inverse of the intensity of the music, if you like. And there are times when that's kind of useful to use. And so that's been put in there as well. So that's gain on the value curves, etc. The other one that I've reworked is Fireworks. Fireworks has been significantly reworked. In part, that's Fire. I hope if I chose the right one. I took something that, well, I refactored it entirely. The code was something I wasn't overly happy with, and so I reworked it. But I've also added a bunch of features, one of which David Peace had submitted, and I reintroduced it. So the number of explosions and all this stuff, so by default it's exactly the same as it ever was. But now there's this X and Y velocity. So if you give something an X velocity, it just means when the explosion happens, they've got an inherently left to right velocity to them. And so all the particles go towards the right when they explode. Okay, and you can do the same thing with the Y velocity. Gravity is now also an option. So when it explodes, you can choose to explode them like they're in space, or explode them where there's gravity, where the particles will start to fall down. If I extend the fade, they last a bit longer, and you'll see that. And you see how they fall back towards Earth. For those that have never tried it, persistence is a great setting to play with Fireworks, because what it does is it actually leaves the trails behind. And so you can see the gravity when you turn on the trails, and how they're sagging down towards the bottom of the screen. The setting that was introduced by David, that I've introduced, is this ability to control the location of the firework. And so when either one of these is not -1, then the location of the firework is now fixed, and it will always occur there. So in this case, it's going to do 16 explosions at that particular point on the screen. The other one here is hold color. That's also new, and that's really only relevant if you're using one of these value curves. So when you do hold color, every time it explodes, it's going to lock in the color at the point that it explodes. But if you turn off hold color, then it will actually change color as the explosion goes on. It's a little bit hard to tell there, possibly because of the duration, if I bring it in a little. But you can see how they're actually changing color as they go. So it's very subtle, but it's there. And I think that's it. I think all the other settings are exactly as they always were. So, but some new effects to play with in the Fireworks. We talked about movement in the shape effect, and so that's all of it. So there's only one other feature, and the other feature is, it's not even really part of the sequencer, but there's a new tool up here. One of the things I was wanting to play with is for xLights around the world this year, Jordan put out a Reaper file, which was basically a set of instructions that the Reaper program could use to take someone's audio file and cut it up in exactly the right shape for the xLights around the world sequence. The sequence that everyone ended up sequencing wasn't the original song. It had a fairly significant amount chopped out of the first minute or so of the song, and then a large slab of the song towards the end. But you had to install Reaper. Reaper comes with a 60-day license. And, and to be honest, this is not an uncommon situation. There's lots of people out there that like to cut their music. They either like to shorten it, cut out certain sections that they don't want in it, or mash together several songs, etc. And that's all well and good. And if you do it just for your show, that's easy to do. But if you then want to share that show, you're in a really, really awkward situation. You either go the route that Jordan went with the Reaper file, and you ask the person to install Reaper and you hope they get all that stuff done in 60 days, or they go and pay for a license, and I can't remember what the license fee is. Or you distribute the file to them, which is, of course, not legal, at least not in any of the countries that I'm aware of, that we generally have users in. And so what I wanted to do was to give you a way to create those files from those instructions without having to go to Reaper. Now, the person authoring it might still need to use Reaper, although we'll show you that that's actually not strictly true. And so the way it works is there's now a new tool up here called Prepare Audio. If you select on it, it's now looking for either a Reaper file or a new file format that I've created called xAudio, which is basically these instructions about how to create a new music track from an old music track. On my desktop, I have the Amazon Reaper file that Jordan created, and so I click OK on that. It loads it up and it says, oh, okay, so it seems that you need to need this particular track here. And so I go up to here and I find the version. Now, it's not the same name, but that's okay. But this is that file that I got from Amazon, so that's all good. I click Open, and now it heads off. And it's come up and it's saying, well, that file already exists. Are you sure? Do you want me to overwrite it? And I can. It doesn't really matter. If I get rid of this, maybe I can get my status bar back. Not so I get rid of my status bar. So it's created that output file, and it's written an MP3, which I can then go and create and sequence. And to as best as I can tell, that MP3 file is identical to the one that Reaper is producing. Now, there are constraints to it. So what can it do? It can take multiple input audio files and cut and slice them together. It can cut any section of any audio file together, if you like. It can overlap those audio tracks and blend them together. It can apply a fade in or a fade out on those audio tracks. Now, I support two types. I support the one where it's probably best described using the waveforms, or sorry, the shape of the waveform. Help if I could type it. I'll do a Sean and use Paintbrush. Oh, let's make this bigger. I normally work with very small images. So normally when you start a song, oops, that's not a pencil. The waveform would look something like that. And when you end a song, normally the waveform would look like that. When you have two segments of the song and you want to cut them together, you would normally overlap them and you would have a waveform or a fade in, fade out that looks like this. And so we basically support these four types of fade ins, fade outs, allowing you to blend the tracks together very, very seamlessly, very easily. But we don't support any filtering. We don't support any of that. But as you see, it quite happily took Jordan's file and reproduced an MP3 file. The alternate format, if I can just quickly show that. He says, there it is. So just so you get a feeling for what's actually in the file if you were choosing to actually build one of these things. So the target file is the default name of the file that it thinks it's going to create. You can override that if you really want to. And then each one of these items is basically a section of an audio track that you're cutting in. The target time is where it ends up in the target file. So 0 is obviously the beginning of the file. And this particular segment is 5.5 seconds long. I'm actually extracting it from the first second of the source file. And this is the source file down here. So it's going to the first second of this file, and it's grabbing 5.5 seconds, and it's going to put it into the target file. The fade in time here is 0.75 seconds, and then it fades out over 0.5 seconds. And because it has this fade out cross fade, it means that's one of those cross fade type fade outs, whereas this doesn't have the cross fade. So it's that sort of ramping up fade in. The gain is the volume adjustment. If it's 1, then the volume just comes through as it was in the original file. This is less than 1, so it's going to slightly reduce the volume of the file. If you go above 1, it will increase the volume of the file. And then I'll just talk about the next one as well, so you can see how they overlap. So this one's target time is 5 seconds, but this one was 5 seconds long, so these things will actually overlap by half a second. And interestingly, the fade in time here is half a second and the fade out time here is half a second. And so that's how you get that crossover of the two waveforms, which makes it sound really good. And then of course this one, so this one has a fade in crossfade. It also has a fade out crossfade because it crossfades with the next one. You don't have to put these in order, but obviously it's a lot easier to do so. This is literally just data that I effectively copied out of the RPP file from Reaper that that Jordan shared. So it's basically the same data. It's just in possibly a slightly easier to read format. The RRP format is a little bit more cryptic, but you know, xLights doesn't care. It will handle both. It's just a simple case of when you run the tool, not that tool, when you run prepare audio, you just come down here and you say, I want the X audio files, and you go and choose the X audio file, and it will do exactly the same thing. And that's it. That's everything in 2019.8 and 19.9. I guess, you know, I guess the first part of the month, there was a lot of stuff on models and 3D and everything else. And for the last few weeks, there's been a stack of stuff around effects and enhancements to effects, etc. So I don't know, it feels like it's a good start to the year. I'm a little concerned that we're 9 releases in and it's barely 1 month gone. I'm sure it's going to slow down at various times during the year. But thanks, guys. Enjoy.